You know what is weird? An entire generation got told they were special, then worked harder than anyone expected, and somehow ended up unable to afford the exact same life that seemed completely normal just one generation earlier. That is not just a passing cultural observation, that is a massive, real-time psychology experiment that nobody actually signed up for. I am talking about millennials, people born roughly between 1981 and 1996. And before you roll your eyes at yet another video or article talking about millennials complaining, I need you to stay with me. Because the psychology of what actually happened to this generation gets uncomfortable in ways you probably haven't thought about. Let's start with the cold, hard data, because context is everything. According to the Pew Research Center, back in 2020, they confirmed a staggering reality. Millennials officially became the first generation in modern American history that is expected to be worse off financially than the generation before them. I want you to really sit with the psychological weight of that statistic. The fundamental premise of the American dream, the unspoken social contract that says if you work hard, your life will sequentially improve, broke down under this specific age group's feet. Because of this, we have an entire demographic walking around with this bizarre psychological cocktail of achievement and failure mixed together in their heads every single day. Imagine being told your whole childhood that you could be anything, win anything, and achieve anything. You were put on the pedestal of the future. The adults in your life looked at you as the culmination of their own hard work. And then you graduated into a massive global recession where the participation trophy you were handed at age 8 suddenly transformed into a master's degree that costs more than a physical house used to. The psychological term for this exact experience, this painful collision between what you believe to be true and the reality you are currently experiencing, is cognitive dissonance. And if you are a millennial, you are basically swimming in it. But here's where your brain should really perk up, because this goes so much deeper than the internet's obsession with student loan complaints and avocado toast jokes. To understand why your burnout feels so exceptionally heavy, we have to rewind and look at the actual timeline of your childhood. You didn't just grow up, you were the primary test subjects for every single parenting trend that came out of the massive self-esteem movement in the 1980s and 90s. Think about the environment you were raised in. This was the birth of the helicopter parents. This was the era where everyone gets a trophy just for showing up on the field, regardless of the score. You were constantly told by teachers, media, and parents that you were smart, unique, and destined for greatness just for existing. Now, it is crucial to understand that these weren't bad intentions. They were earnest attempts at better parenting based on the very best psychology that was available to your parents at the time. The adults in your life wanted to protect your self-worth and give you the confidence they perhaps didn't have growing up. They wanted to shield you from the harshness of the world by building up your internal self-esteem. But what happens when you take a highly plastic, developing brain and collide that highly curated, endlessly validating upbringing with the cold, unforgiving reality of the modern economy? The results are psychologically jarring. Psychologist Jean Twenge literally wrote a book called Generation Me, studying this exact generational phenomenon. Through her extensive research, she found something fascinating that critics of millennials love to quote out of context. Millennials actually score higher on narcissism scales than previous generations. You were explicitly taught to focus on your self-esteem, so naturally you do. But, and this is the part that will really mess with you, the part the critics always leave out, her research also shows that millennials score significantly higher on anxiety and depression. I want you to think about the incredible burden of that contradiction. You have an entire generation of people who simultaneously think they are special, yet frequently feel completely worthless. You were handed a cognitive blueprint for a world that promised you success, stability, and reward if you just followed the rules. But when you stepped out the door to claim it, you hit your 20s right as the economy imploded in 2008. You graduated into a job market that had fundamentally changed and suddenly found yourself navigating a completely different economic reality than the one you had been heavily prepared for. The whiplash of that transition alone should have hospitalized people. What you're left with isn't just everyday adult stress. It's a profound, exhausting, daily cognitive dissonance that you can't seem to shake. It is, quite literally, a trauma response with a LinkedIn profile. You are constantly trying to perform the success you were promised while quietly drowning in the reality you were handed. Let me throw something at you that might feel a tad more personal. To truly understand the burnout you are feeling today, we have to look at the invisible psychological agreement you signed without ever realizing it. You see, millennials were sold a very specific story about how effort equals outcome. Study hard, go to college, get a good job, work your way up. I want you to really think about how deeply that formula was drilled into your subconscious. From your earliest days in the classroom, this wasn't presented to you as a mere suggestion or a risky gamble or one of many possible paths you could take in life. It was presented as an ironclad guarantee. It was the ultimate social contract. You were told that if you simply played by the rules and put in the effort, the system would reward you with stability, respect, and a comfortable life. That social contract seemed pretty straightforward, and honestly, it had worked for a long time. Your parents had largely seen that exact formula work for them, so they passed it down to you with complete sincerity. But then, you grew up. You did exactly what you were told. You took the standardized tests, you got the degrees, and you stepped out into the world. Except the economic landscape shifted in ways that nobody really anticipated. When millennials showed up ready to follow that path, they found that college now costs 10 times what it used to. You stepped into a hiring landscape where the rules had fundamentally changed overnight, finding yourself in this bizarre, exhausting paradox where entry-level jobs require 5 years of experience, and here's $80,000 in debt. Instead of the corporate ladder you were promised, you were handed a gig economy where you're an independent contractor with no benefits. You were told you were entering a stable career market, but instead, you found yourself needing a side hustle just to afford groceries, all while carrying a student loan payment that rivals a traditional mortgage. Take a deliberate, pregnant pause here in your voiceover. Let the weight of that reality sink in for the viewer. In cognitive psychology, a schema is the mental framework you use to organize and understand the world around you. It is your foundational blueprint for reality. The psychological term for when reality fundamentally violates your core beliefs about how the world works is schema disruption. This is where the academic psychology perfectly explains your hidden pain. Schema disruption isn't just having a bad day or facing a tough job market. It is a profound, jarring psychological event where the map you were given to navigate your life turns out to be entirely fabricated. Your brain doesn't just casually accept that kind of systemic betrayal. And when it happens on a generational scale, you don't just get disappointed people. You get a complete rewiring of how an entire age group relates to institutions, authority, and the concept of a stable future. This psychological rewiring is exactly what explains why millennials are often characterized as both idealistic and deeply cynical at the same time. You probably feel this tension in your own chest every time you watch the news or log into work. You still believe things should be fair, you just no longer believe they will be. When older generations look at you, they often mistake that attitude for pessimism. But it isn't pessimism, it is pattern recognition in action. You have learned through repeated exposure to economic instability that the system is not designed to protect you. And the job work thing, man, millennials get absolutely roasted for job hopping and not being loyal to companies. You have probably sat through countless lectures or read endless think pieces from older generations complaining that you lack grit, that you don't want to put in the time, or that you're too eager to jump ship the moment things get difficult. You know what's psychologically fascinating about that criticism? It completely ignores the reality of the environment. Corporate America fundamentally changed the employment relationship over the past few decades. The traditional markers of corporate loyalty, the things that made staying at one company for 40 years actually worth it, vanished. Pensions disappeared, full-time positions became contract work, mass layoffs became normalized business strategy. You are being asked to show undying loyalty to institutions that will cut your position on a Tuesday afternoon to temporarily boost their quarterly shareholder margins. Millennials didn't invent this lack of loyalty, they just adapted to an employment landscape that had already changed. When you leave a job after 18 months for a slight bump in pay, That isn't a character flaw. It's a completely rational response to an environment that treats workers as interchangeable. You were simply playing by the new rules of the game you were forced to enter. And there's another layer to this schema disruption that makes your generation's psychological profile so incredibly unique. Millennials are also one of the most educated generations in history and the most diverse. But more importantly, when defining them, the first thing that comes to mind is teen internet culture. You were the generation that grew up with the internet. You were the pioneers of the digital frontier during your most formative developmental years. This creates a very specific psychological profile, one who questions everything because they've seen the many versions of truth depending on who's telling the story. You didn't just get your information from one trusted evening news anchor. You saw raw, unfiltered reality from 1,000 different angles online. Because of this, you naturally interrogate the systems around you. But people who interrogate the status quo often get labeled as entitled or difficult, but critical thinking meeting systems that were never designed to be questioned will look like that. You aren't being difficult, you're just refusing to blindly accept a broken social contract.
While you were trying to navigate this deeply broken economic landscape, you were simultaneously hit with another massive psychological variable that fundamentally altered the way your brain processes reality: social media. But here is what makes your generation's relationship with the internet so incredibly unique, and frankly, so exhausting. You didn't get it as little kids like Gen Z who have never known a world without algorithms, and you didn't adopt it as fully established, secure adults like Generation X or the Boomers. You got social media right in your absolute most formative years. You were handed this technology as teenagers and young adults during the exact biological window when your core identities were still forming. Facebook launched in 2004, and Instagram arrived in 2010. I want you to think about what that timing actually meant for your psychological development. It means that millennials had to learn how to be adults while simultaneously learning how to perform their lives for a digital audience. You weren't just figuring out who you were figuring out how to neatly package and broadcast who you were to hundreds or eventually thousands of acquaintances. Every awkward phase, every career misstep, every relationship status became public domain. Dr. Tim Kasser's extensive research on materialism and well-being provides the exact academic framework for why this feels so incredibly draining. His work shows that when people base their self-worth on external validation, their overall mental health absolutely tanks. And external validation is literally the exact mechanism that social media trains you to seek out and rely on. When you log onto these platforms, you are stepping onto a stage that never actually closes. You're essentially running a 24/7 political campaign for your own existence, and the polls never close. You are constantly measuring your behind-the-scenes struggles against the highly curated, beautifully filtered highlight reels of everyone you have ever met. It is an impossible metric for success, and it creates a persistent, low-grade anxiety that hums in the background of your entire life. Now, I want you to take that exhausting digital performance and pile it directly on top of the economic schema disruption we just talked about. Because of the economy you inherited, millennials are delaying or completely skipping the traditional life milestones that used to give previous generations a concrete sense of adult identity. I'm talking about the foundational markers of growing up, marriage, homeownership, and having kids. If you look at the data, surveys show that millennials absolutely still want these things. You haven't rejected the concept of a home or a family, but the harsh economic reality makes achieving them borderline impossible without pre-existing family wealth or extraordinary lottery-level luck. You are working just as hard, if not harder, than the generations before you, but the goalposts have been moved miles down the field. Because of this, we now have an entire demographic of people in their 30s and 40s who still feel this lingering, uncomfortable sensation that they are waiting for their real life to finally start. You look in the mirror and you know your biological age, but psychologically you feel like you are trapped in a holding pattern. The waiting room for your actual adulthood is a studio apartment that costs $2,200 a month, and your therapist is booked until March. Take another long, empathetic pause here. This is the hidden pain that needs validation. You might think that feeling stuck is just a personal failure, or that you just need to budget better or hustle harder. But the impact of this prolonged uncertainty is surprisingly well documented in clinical psychology. When achieving the traditional markers of what society defines as adulthood becomes unattainable, your brain doesn't just logically shrug its shoulders and seamlessly move on. Your nervous system doesn't know about inflation or housing market crashes or the gig economy. It only knows that it's supposed to be transitioning into a new phase of life, and that transition is being blocked. Instead of adapting peacefully, your body creates this constant low-level physiological stress that researchers refer to as allostatic load. Allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body that accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. In your case, it's your body's persistent biological tendency to prepare for a milestone that never actually comes. It's the stress of bracing for an impact or preparing for a marathon, but the starting gun never goes off. You are carrying the heavy biological cost of anticipation every single day without ever getting the release of actually arriving at your destination. It's sort of like being permanently stuck in the loading screen of your own life. You're sitting there, the music is playing, the fan on the console is whirring, but when you look at the progress bar, you see it hasn't moved an inch in the past decade. And the cruelest part of this digital panopticon is that while you're sitting in that loading screen carrying this massive allostatic load, you are forced to watch the highly curated feed of the tiny percentage of people who actually did make it through. You are constantly bombarded with the manufactured success of others, which only deepens your own cognitive dissonance and makes your nervous system work twice as hard just to maintain a baseline level of sanity. Your burnout isn't because you are weak. Your burnout is the mathematical result of an overloaded nervous system trying to perform for a digital audience while surviving an economic reality that offers absolutely zero structural support.
Let's wrap this up by looking at one final massive contradiction. You are the first generation to widely destigmatize therapy and talk about anxiety and depression as real things rather than character flaws. That is a massive cultural achievement. But here is the cruel irony. You are doing this while living in conditions that are objectively more stressful than previous decades. You are navigating unthinkable student debt and housing costs that have completely outpaced wage growth, creating a weird dynamic where you are simultaneously more self-aware, yet far more overwhelmed. And let's not forget the future. You are the generation that gets to watch the planet actively deteriorate while being told that you are the ones who need to fix it, despite having comparatively less institutional power and resources to do anything at scale. Climate anxiety is now a legitimate psychological phenomenon, serving you existential dread with a side of helplessness. You are a generation shaped by impossibly high expectations, economic instability, constant performance pressure, delayed adulthood, and a front-row seat to multiple overlapping crises. And despite all of that, society looks at you and asks, "Why are you so anxious? And why can't you just buy a house?" Your burnout is not a personal failure. The psychology of millennials becomes incredibly predictable when you look at what you have actually been through. You are responding exactly how humans respond when the landscape shifts beneath them and the map they were given no longer matches the territory. If this hit home for you, please subscribe to The Human Blueprint. If you want to directly support these deep dives into the psychology of our generations, hit that join button to become a channel member. I genuinely appreciate your support, and I have some other videos queued up on the screen that share this exact same kind of depth. I will see you in the next one.